So there's many important factors that contribute to environmental health and the global burden of disease, but many of them are really hard to disentangle one from the next, and they can be especially hard to intervene on. If I asked you to name a dam, however, at least one probably comes to mind.
The Hoover Dam.
It's a good example. Or maybe instead you thought of the Three Gorges Dam in China, which is a feat of engineering and a source of power for many millions of people. Or maybe you thought of a dam a little bit closer to home. The point is, they're not that uncommon. The reasons for building dams might be different between countries, but regardless of the context, it's certain that dams are going to affect the environment and the nearby communities. It's important to think about the benefits and the problems of dams in both the context of geography and time.
In this map, we can see that there are many dams in the world, some in areas with bigger access to water and some of them with more arid regions. Let's first think about a few effects of building a dam on the Nile River. Since ancient time, food production in this region has relied on the highly fertile soils fed from the Nile River, being able to control with dams can increase food security by controlling against flooding and drought. However, changing the structure of the Nile River can affect species living downstream. For example, an increase in snail habitat can increase transmission of schistomiasis. Now let's go to Washington. Here, the building of the Grand Coulee Dam as early as 1941 cut off access to salmon migrating upstream to spawn. Before, these fish would travel more than 1,000 miles in the Columbia River to reach tributaries above the dam. The effect of the dam doesn't stop at fish. It also affects humans and animals who consume the fish. Dams can cause accumulation of chemicals like PCB in fish and in consumers.
So in spite of the potential adverse impacts, we keep building dams for hydroelectricity. They're often touted as being a clean source of energy, but like most things, this is relative. So if we think about other options, perhaps dams are better. They don't produce the air pollution and the associated health problems that something like burning coal, for example, might. But we need to remember that energy in every form has a different cost. So we're going to focus a little bit on the Columbia River Basin to highlight some of the pros and the cons of dams in the context of environmental health. So the Columbia produces the most electricity of any river in North America, and prior to damming, it was producing the most salmon in the world. It's a good system to look at because the headwaters of the Columbia are in Canada, but the river actually spills into the Pacific Ocean in Oregon in the United States. So because it crosses these two different countries, there's political implications for anything that's done on the river. So changes in the water speed and the temperature are allowing for different fish species to thrive along the river.
So there's often an imbalance in terms of who is bearing the brunt of the costs when dams are built. Dams often result in displacement of local communities and changes to the habitat and wildlife near the dams. The energy produced from dams tends to be provided to urban centers far removed from the dam site, while the impacts of the dam are felt more locally. The benefits and costs of dams are not distributed evenly, geographically, or in time. There are many short-term benefits, but long-term costs. While the creation of a dam can initially provide jobs, its utility wanes over time, and long-term maintenance and risks ensue. Historically, the burden of costs from dams has fallen heavily on First Nations communities, whose traditional lifestyle relies on healthy salmon populations. Several recent studies have looked into the health of fish populations and the health of communities who consume them. Fish living in reservoirs around dams have elevated levels of contaminants due to the settling out of chemicals from sediment buildup in water flow reduced areas.
So many of the dams that were built along the Columbia were built in the early 1900s, but they're still there even though they're not being used for their original purpose. Maintenance of these dams is expensive and it can be quite tricky. Dam failures have catastrophic consequences though. So if we look at the Teton Dam in Idaho, it caused 11 human deaths, the loss of close to 13,000 livestock, and a claim for more than double the building costs of the dam itself. Recent headlines remind us that dams are aging. So there's a growing trend towards actually investing in dam remediation projects and the removal of some of these unused dams. And we need to remember that as climate change continues, it's affecting access to water worldwide. Resource management is remaining an important issue. Dams are often associated with environmental destruction, but researchers have shown recently that dams on the Columbia might actually be protecting against some of these climate change effects through regulation of changes in water flow and reducing variability of water levels.
This year, renegotiation talks of previous dam and energy share agreements with the US and Canada are resurfacing. Our knowledge of the effects of dams has grown enormously. Current discussion on dam management must account for recent research findings on fish species populations and ecosystem health, as well as human health. With the removal of large dams like the Elwha and the Conduit, we have a unique opportunity to reverse some of the impacts that have resulted from the construction of these dams.
So now more than ever, consultation with First Nations, a thorough and extensive environmental impact assessment, and measures to mitigate the effects of dams on the environment are needed. As dam infrastructure weakens with time, we really need to think about whether the costs of maintaining these dams are warranted or whether actually removing them is maybe a better option. We need to seek out as much information as we can to identify the connections between dams and the environment and human health. We need to engage in a discussion on this topic in order to make the best choice for the future.